By popular demand, I'm going to show everyone how to achieve this type of look for your stonework or even cobblestones on a street for your miniatures, dioramas, war games. It's quite simple, really. These are the supplies that you'll need, and I'm actually on vacation at my folks' house, so I don't even have my modeling area or any of those tools available. I had some leftover craft paints like these, various light grays, dark grays, and then this is an important piece, the yellow oxide. You can get any of these at Michael's. You don't need these sizes. Usually these little sizes will be more than sufficient to make lots of terrain. These are just what I had available. You'll need styrofoam. This is the extruded polystyrene foam that they use to insulate buildings here in the US. I believe this is also available in the UK. Might be a different name, but it also comes in blue or purple. This piece is very old. I found it in the garage, as again, I'm not even at home. I'm just using the back of this piece to demonstrate what we're going to be doing. This stuff is going to be our grout, and this is Durham's rock hard water putty. It's available at any Home Depot or any any good sized hardware store here in the US. I am not sure if this is available in the UK or Europe, but you probably find something similar. It dries pretty fast, work time is pretty slow, and it is rock hard, like it says. It is not a supplement. Don't leave it in the kitchen, because had a few close calls with that one. People that didn't know what it was. Also some sponge pieces. I just use these are just off of an ordinary household sponge. We're interested in this side, the rougher side with the little, looks like a loofah kinda. You could even use a loofah. Some crappy paint brushes. You don't need to go all out on that. Just something that'll slap paint on there. It's a smaller brush I used too later for details. I didn't have that pictured, but a pencil, preferably a more dull pencil, an X-Acto knife, and a crumbled up ball of tin foil, and that's for texture. So let's go ahead and start by tracing out our rock pattern on the polystyrene. Okay, so when you're drawing the rock pattern, really at this stage you can choose any pattern you want. I'm just going with a standard kind of castle or fortress wall pattern, but again, really the sky's the limit with that. I'm leaving space between the individual stones or bricks, and I'm varying some of the shapes slightly and the sizes too to look like rubble, because if you ever look at a very old building or old castle ruins, typically it's not just a clean brick pattern like we might see on buildings made today. So add some bigger rocks here, and this doesn't have to be too uniform. This is pretty self-explanatory step. Usually before you start a project like this on polystyrene, it's a good idea to sand it on the side that you're using. I just go ahead and do both sides, because the surface of it when you get it is somewhat hard, and it has no texture, so if you try to paint or do anything over that, you're just going to break the foam like a piece of ice, and it's not going to look as good. Okay, so now we got the pattern traced, and we're going to take the X-Acto knife, and it's a good idea to use as sharp of a blade as you can. It would be a good idea to use the one straight out of the knife package, otherwise it can kind of damage the foam as you're carving it. And we're just going to cut out each individual stone, or at least just trace along the edges with the hobby knife. This is the most tedious step, this and the next step, and it's not the funnest part, but after this, it's going to be more toward getting down to the grouting and the painting, which is really the fun part of this project. Okay, so now we're going to move on by taking the X-Acto knife and opening up the grout lines between all of the stones that we just traced with the same knife. Again, a sharp knife is needed for this. It's still kind of tearing the foam, but alternatively you could use a hot wire foam cutter. I'm thinking about getting one of those just to make this kind of process a little easier, but I'm just kind of working with what I have for purposes of testing these techniques. With a raw wall like this, depending on what pattern you're going for, if you're going for a pattern like mine where it's supposed to be reminiscent of an old kind of hodgepodge stone wall where it might have been repaired or broken or weathered over time, and different stones used to build it and repair it over time, it probably won't matter very much if you make a mistake. And this process is by no means an exact science, I mean, unless you're going for that with your pattern. But and then as we do that, it's a good idea to take the pencil to round off some of these bricks by pressing the pencil into the grout lines. You can even do this in areas that are a little too fragile to cut like that. I didn't have the knife there before, but all of these areas are going to be filled in our next step in the process. And with these little areas, it becomes a little harder to do. With these smaller rocks, the foam will want to come off in bigger pieces than what you're trying to do. But you don't have to worry too much about that. So this is pretty ubiquitous with other stone wall making tutorials you find around YouTube or the web. But as a crumbled up ball of tin foil, we're just going to use that to texture, make this look a lot more weathered and realistic. This foam does a great job of taking that, even see on an unused portion there, it creates a nice random texture. But you take this opportunity as well to press in some of the areas, particularly the areas that are more smaller rocks or scree. It's like where the main wall is worn away and left fillers and aggregates underneath. And at this point, we end up with something like that, which you could even paint that by itself at this point. Depending on how the light hits it, it ends up looking pretty good. Okay, now we've mixed up some of the Durham's water putty, and it's best to use a very small ratio of small amount of water for every plastic. It's plastic, don't worry, Mom. Tablespoon of powder that you use, so you get this kind of slurry stuff going on. And depending on how you want to do it, just kind of put it all over the area. And I'm going to use my finger because I don't care. And I might waste a little bit of it. You're always going to waste this stuff because you'll always have to make more than what you'll need because of the ratios and how that always plays out. But just make sure you get it into the all the gaps. You might use your residual there. Just gotta get it in there. Alternatively, you could use a brush. It would have to be a very cheap and very expendable brush because this stuff is like concrete. It's pretty cheap. I believe that big, last time I checked, it's a couple years old, but about $7 to $8 US at a hardware store that carries it. They probably have other brands of water putty available. So it looks like we got some pretty good covering on that now. We're going to take this paper towel, and there's probably a better way to do this, but I don't care. So we're just going to wipe off all the excess. I found it doesn't really help to get it wet, but we just wipe off all of this extra, so you only have the mortar left in the recesses. You will lose a little bit of the texture that you got with the tinfoil ball, but that's okay because some of it is still there, and we're going to make up for it in the painting stage. After this is dry, which you know, go do something else for a few hours. You know, if you do this before you go to work, you come back after a normal work day, it will most certainly be dry. It's not overnight or anything like that. I would give it more time than what it says on the bottle just to be safe, but our next step is going to prime it white, and that's going to be where we'll pick up again. Alright, so we've got the texture has dried, and as you can see, it becomes quite hard surface like a rock. I primed it with white. I could have done a couple other coats on this. I kind of just did one coat. I watered it down ever so slightly. You're still getting a little bit of the paint coming through there. Not too much though. It actually works to our advantage with the color palette that we're using here. I don't know if blue foam would have any different result, but we're going to start applying the stone coloring now. And this is where really the project starts to get fun. You take your bit of sponge. I think they make little paint rollers. I just was too lazy to go buy one, so I just cannibalized a household sponge. So we're looking at this texture, and we're going to use some of our light gray paint, kind of make it into a little roller, easier to grip, and kind of get some paint on it. And then we're going to roll it over, and what this is going to do is create kind of a marbling, so that washes over it will have more of a natural stone texture. You can also dabble it a little bit, but just the key is to make it not look too uniform. You don't want to have too much paint on the sponge when you're doing this, because it could make a patch that'll look a little odd when it's all said and done. It would contrast too sharply. See, when you do this, even on these white portions, you can see there, like on these edges, it doesn't have as much of the different washes. It looks very much like concrete, just with the sponging over the white. So we're gonna keep kind of doing this darker and lighter in some areas, depending on how the texture takes it. too much there. Alright, so then we're left with something like that. And that's where Mr. Sponge makes his exit. So now I'm going to use that same gray color down here on the palette, but what I'm going to do is thin it out very much. So really thin, because you know it's similar to a watercolor. So just apply it so that we start to tone down some of that white. We start to blend it in a little bit so that we're no longer white and gray. Now we're white and light gray and darker gray, and it starts to get that texturing. Like that by itself already looks pretty convincing. So then you probably even hit this with a hair dryer to speed up the drying, as long as it's not too hot, because you don't want to get the foam melted. But we're going to wait for this to dry and come back in a few minutes. Okay, now we're going to take this darker gray, make another wash, and just start adding it to areas to get some, I needed some more opacity there. Start adding it to some areas to get some variety, and it starts to change the tone, because this dark gray, as opposed to this light gray, has a little more brown, I believe. And it's really about getting the right consistency, because you don't want to drown out all the work underneath. But think glaze. Like if you're painting the miniatures, you have a similar technique when you're applying a glaze. That is all I'm going to do with that. I hit it with a hair dryer. Works really quickly. Right, now I'm going to mix some of this black on the palette into the dark gray to make a yet darker color. And start, probably going to switch to a smaller brush as well. I'm going to start hitting the some areas with this darker wash. Anywhere that's a lower lying area, like like these smaller areas in here, you probably want to use that wash in there, and just have fun with it. Just kind of draw it into areas where you feel is appropriate. There's really no right or wrong answer. And maybe make some stripes or some little stippling of different types of rock. Even apply layers on top of layers to create some depth. It's like, and at this point also, you can also start to add some different colorations by increasing the concentration of the wash. This is pure black, and I haven't even transferred it over. Maybe put a little gray. And at this point, the trick is just watering it down and not so much mixing it, but you might want to start adding some variety with the stones. See, these ones I'm choosing to make darker. Too much. Using to make these ones darker, and it might take a few layers depending on how opaque you're making your paints. Just like with miniatures, you want to ensure that you are thinning the wash so that you don't get too much variation. See down here, this is probably about as dark as I'll go with those. But if you look at a real wall, typically all of the different stones that make up a wall are not going to be the same type of rock or even necessarily found in the same area, so you're going to see a lot of variety. I just use my fingers to correct mistakes because I don't care. But you know, if you picture a castle wall, most people will say it's gray, but if you really look at historical examples, they're going to be a lot of different shades. And okay, so make this one dark too. That was really dark. This one up here just doesn't really want to take the dark wash for some reason. Anyway. There we go. Okay, so we got some of the black on there, darker stones. I think now I'm going to start in with my more red-brown color, and for that I'm using a color that's called russet. And I've seen this color mentioned in other online tutorials, but with this color you're going really thin because it's a pretty strong color, so you just want to feather that into areas, again, in a random fashion, just like a real rock wall. Highly encourage you to look at stones on buildings. But you just start kind of putting that on there. I hear there's a lot of white here, so. And same with the, as with the dark color, you might overlap even too a little bit. But same as with the dark colors, after you do little washes there, start making stones more this color, as I'm doing here, like, and it depends, like this isn't the only type of rock wall you can do with this technique. You can make a sandstone wall with browns and beiges instead of grays, depending on where your model is located and what type of stones you can find in the area. So I think with that, that'll be good. Now I'm gonna have this dry. The hair dryer really helps. Okay. Now, when I was doing research on how to get the look I wanted, I was going for a kind of a yellowy look. So I've taken the yellow oxide paint which looks like this, and you can find it at Michael's, yellow oxide. It's a very useful color. I also took just basic brown. It's a really big container, but doesn't need to be. And it's a nice medium brown. And I found with the yellow by itself, it is a little too yellow and unnatural, so I mixed it with this brown to get this. And with this one, we're watering it down quite a bit and slathering it over large sections, you know, ever so slightly. You can even get that onto the other stones. Like, don't be afraid to get that on the black stones or the russet stones, because it doesn't make any difference. Rocks are made of lots of different smaller rocks. In varying degrees. This one ends up being a little bit more of a sandstone look, and you just be random with it and have some fun. Add a little more yellow onto that guy there. Okay, let's dry this off. I think that'll about do it. So now, the last thing we need to do is line in. If you've been in painting or miniature painting, you know what that is. It's just creating a little more of a distinction. Because still at certain angles with this, like if you turn it there, you don't really know what it is. You turn it that way, you're still not really convinced that it's stone unless you're looking at it straight on. So what this does is creates more of that 3D effect. Brings it back a little bit because we kind of blended together these stones during the grouting process earlier. We're looking for really thin, but enough so that there's opacity, so probably like this, like black watercolor. And we're going to, we're not washing anymore, we're just, and you know, you probably get away with just making lines on some of these, like here. There's not really a defined space for the stone to end, so I'm just going to fake it by putting a line. And this is just about creating definition. And I think this is really what makes the details pop on a project like this. Okay, so I think that we got this pretty much finished up now. So there you have it. There's a comparison to the original that I did yesterday. Looks about the same. With this type of technique, I chose it just because I wanted more yellow, interesting walls instead of just the flat gray that you typically see. I'm planning a string of more advanced projects. You'd use this technique with a lot of other things as well. But there you have it. There's going to be more tutorials coming for various different other topics. I'm going to make trees and landscaping, and then several variety of buildings. So feel free to like, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.